First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody on this call. This is our first Ask an Expert webinar. We're very excited to be able to present this information today. We feel like it's very timely, and hopefully those of you on the call will be able to walk away with some good information to take back to your organizations. Today's webinar is Return to Work and Workplace Violence. My name is Peterson, and I am the president at Protus 3, and I'm going to be your moderator today. For those of you who don't know Protus 3, we create customized security solutions for clients who have assets that are critical to their business, which I would certainly think is every business out there, or an agency and organization. I've been in the security field for just on 29 years now, though I'm only 32 and a half. And my expertise is in performing security assessments at businesses, hospitals, K through 12, private schools, colleges, and universities. I'm also very involved in the development of workplace violence and de-escalation programs. I'm very excited today to be able to introduce two members of our team that come to us with different areas of expertise, and that is Tasha Dyson and Chuck Hurst, and I will ask them to introduce themselves. So Tasha?
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Tasha Dyson. I've been here at Protus 3 for almost 20 years. I am older than 32 and a half. I do most of my work with investigations, largely background investigations. So I get involved in workplace violence when it comes to threat assessments and gathering information about individuals.
And Chuck?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chuck Hurst, and I am the investigations manager here at Protus 3. My background is law enforcement, and that profession has been instrumental in shaping my window to the world, so to speak. I'm showing my age here, but I've got a little over 38 years experience now in investigations. So I feel very confident that we can handle anything you throw our way. During my career, I was fortunate to serve in a broad range of assignments, which afforded me the opportunity to develop a wide breadth of experience. And that experience has certainly served me well in my law enforcement career, and again in my second career with Protus 3.
Thank you, Chuck. And Amanda Strickland is going to be also a part of the team today, and she's helping to manage the webinar. Amanda, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Hi, I'm Amanda Strickland. I graduated from Meredith College in 2017. I've been with Protus 3 for about 2 years now. I mainly do computer forensics and assist with investigations.
A couple of the housekeeping items before we get started. So, the apps are not we're also not HR professionals. Our area of expertise is security and the protection of assets. So let's get started. Chuck and Tasha, we all know that COVID-19 has had a mind-boggling effect on all of us, not only as business professionals, but as individuals, as employees, as leaders, as parents, as children. And so we're thinking that we're headed to the light at the end of the tunnel after, this abrupt stop that seemed to invade all of our lives in March. And we're getting really excited about it. We're looking for that new normal, that sense of everything is going to be all right. And suddenly we're talking about workplace violence. So, Chuck, let's start with you. What's the connection between COVID-19 and workplace violence?
Well, that's a good question. I'll start out with a little bit of a history lesson. And I know many of the folks on this webinar are security and HR, so this is probably no news to you. Workplace violence has been in existence long before COVID-19 or coronavirus became household terms. All the same triggers and stressors that can lead to workplace violence in a pre-COVID-19 environment are still here. Only now they're going to be enhanced or exacerbated by the arrival of the virus. With the pandemic and the stay-at-home orders and all the associated things with it, people become nervous, edgy, unsettled. You know, don't go here, don't do that, wear a mask, don't wear a mask. A lot of information, some contradictory. You know, it's certainly reasonable for even the most level-headed person to become a bit unsettled. You know, factor in the divisiveness and the polarization and the civil unrest taking place, and the tension is almost palpable. You can feel it, you can touch it, you can see it. So as businesses reopen and you know, kind of bring their workforce and staff back in the doors, all those problems and stressors and triggers are coming in those doors.
Excellent point. Tasha, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I'd say that as a general rule, at any given moment in time, you've got people in the workplace who are under stress for a variety of reasons. They may have criminal trouble, they may have marital problems, child support, custody issues, health issues, mental health issues. Sometimes mental health issues exacerbated by or leading to, you know, people who self-medicate with drugs, alcohol, and other addictive behaviors. All of those people are in the workplace at any given moment, but now we all have the added stress of coronavirus and COVID-19. So it's just one more thing to add to the list of stressors that people already have.
Very good. So Chuck, workplace violence, we tend to think, or the media would lead us to jump right to active shooter. But that's not what we're talking about here. I mean, active shooter is a part of it. Can you speak to that a little bit? When we talk about workplace violence, what are we talking about?
Yeah, and to your point, Chris, most people probably get a mental image of the most extreme form of workplace violence, which of course is an active shooter event, a horrific event. And although they happen all too frequently, they don't happen daily and weekly like other forms of workplace violence. It can be subtle, it can be overt, it can be covert, it can be harassment, it can be intimidation, it can be bullying, it can be offensive language, it can be verbal fights, it can be physical fights, or similar activities that cause people to disrupt or change their work habits or their patterns. And I think Tasha will speak to it in a little more detail, but it's really a wide-ranging spectrum of things that take place within the workplace, and probably many times come from home to the workplace and then go back. So it's kind of a vicious, never-ending cycle there.
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of really important points. One is the domestic violence that spills into the workforce. And the other one that you alluded to was the fact that the world has changed. At least over my career, I know that it has changed dramatically, and what might have been deemed acceptable 20 years ago is not. And sometimes that takes retraining of our employees so that they understand in our environment what the expectation is. Tasha, would you add, I know electronics and the cyber world has changed the world as well.
Yeah, when we're talking about this spectrum of workplace violence, from all the way from active shooter on down to harassment and bullying, verbal fights, a lot of those can take place electronically, not just person to person in the same office, but by text, by phone, by email, by chat or instant message, on social media. So it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be just person to person, but can also be through electronic means as well.
Yeah, and we see that an awful lot, especially as people are feeling the stress. You know, they'll use the electronic versions of media as a way to, what they think is anonymously maybe post some things or to rant and rave and get some of that emotion out.
It's also easier, a whole lot easier to say ugly things to people when you don't have to look them in the eye.
That's true. That's true. So what are some of the tools every employer should have in their toolbox? Tasha, you want to start that one?
Yeah, I think the most important tool anytime, any place is always communication. And that's communication from the top down. That's communication from the bottom up. That's communication across departments and across silos, if you will, across the organization. You know, in security, we always say, see something, say something. That's a really powerful tool that we use, and we use a lot. But it's important to remember that see something, say something doesn't just apply to security. You can use that essentially for any condition you find in the workplace that requires attention. Sometimes that's a safety issue. Sometimes that's an HR issue when you've got a coworker that's not quite acting right or something seems off. See something, say something.
Excellent. You know, really important, that communication, and it goes back to creating that culture where people feel safe and feel like that they can come forward and their concerns will be addressed in a responsive and not reactive way. Chuck, would you add to the tools in the employer's toolbox?
Well, Tasha mentioned communication and touched upon how important it is for it to be a two-way street there. That is critical to any intervention tool in workplace violence or risk mitigation. And without that two-way exchange and that trust, then it's going to be much more difficult for the organization to come up with interventional strategies dealing with workplace violence or other safety or risk factors. There's a couple of biggies in that toolbox. One is a risk assessment team. And I know that if you put that in an acronym, it spells RAT. Okay, I get that. But, you know, to see something, say something, goes back to communication. You want your employees to be stakeholders in their business, in their company, and to want to help supervisors, management executives to solve problems and to avert any type of potential workplace violence or other safety or peril within the company. A risk assessment team can do some analysis, some collecting and collating of information. They can process it and then pass it on to the appropriate decision makers who hopefully can make informed decisions. A threat assessment is also the second part of it, and that's a comprehensive evaluation of the employee at risk or a group of employees. And it's very detailed, and it has several different moving parts within it, and they're all important. And it's best when it's used in tandem with a risk management team.
Very good. And so, Tasha, when we talk about a risk assessment team, tell me a little bit more about what we're talking about.
Sure. So a risk assessment team really is a subset of the company. They're a group that's brought together in order to solve problems or to work on problems that affect the entire organization. In a small organization, you might have a risk assessment team that's only 2 people. In a large organization, you might have a whole lot more people on the team, depending on your needs. The trick is to have a risk assessment team that's large enough to get the job done, but not so large that it's unwieldy.
Chuck, would you add to that?
I would, and probably in terms of what a risk assessment team is not. It's not an armed security component of your company or even an unarmed security component of the company. They are tasked with identifying risk or perils or hazards within the company, and then hopefully coming up with viable solutions to minimize and manage those risks. There should not be any misinterpretation of the role of a risk assessment team. And you know, I was a cop for 30 years, and the rank and file, the men and women who make up the rank and file of law enforcement often have the best ideas about things. They're there every day working in the streets, in the field. They see it, they feel it, they know what's going on. So oftentimes the best ideas come from the bottom up and not just the top down. And you may look at the risk assessment team and say, well, why is there nobody from the rank and file on it? And there's a couple of reasons. One is liability, and the other is some privacy concerns. You may be dealing with medical or health information, particularly mental health information. So nonetheless, it goes back to that communication factor that Tasha mentioned in the see something, say something. The workers, the staff, the ones who make up the brunt of any company or organization are vital to any risk assessment team, even though they may not occupy a space on the team itself.
Yeah, that's, really interesting because over the 29 or so years that I've been in the security field, one of the real challenges that we've had is the divide between different departments within a company that form that sort of silo effect and make it hard for the different groups to work together to look at a situation and to develop the best responses. But I'm hearing more and more from customers that since COVID-19, that those lines of communication have just, they've really changed. We've got executives that are communicating in ways that are authentic and very different than they have before. Instead of them just communicating to their next in line and it going down, there's more direct routes. And so, one of the things that we're seeing is these committees formed around dealing with COVID-19. Would you guys weigh in and tell our audience what you think? Can that same team, that same risk assessment team that's dealing with COVID, also deal with workplace violence? Tasha, would you take that one?
I would. So much like a risk assessment team can address all sorts of issues. Right now, the one that's first and foremost in everyone's mind, I think, is COVID-19. First, the question was, how do we continue to work and let people work at home? And then now the question is sort of becoming, how do we get people back to work safely? That risk assessment team should be formed by a representative from HR, from legal, from security, from safety, from facilities, someone from the executive level. All of those departments and all of those individuals have different perspectives on the organization and different abilities to see different things, and different ways to tap into outside resources as needed. Chuck mentioned the rank and file, and it is good to have representatives of the rank and file providing information, but on the risk assessment team, because you're dealing with issues of confidentiality, they wouldn't necessarily be on it.
I'd like to ask our audience to use that chat box to weigh in. Do you have a risk assessment team in your organization? Have you developed one that looks at employees that are at risk or of concern or deals with situations that are concerning? We'd love to, and we'll share that information when we get to the question and answer program. Chuck and Tasha, what should be the mission, roles, and responsibilities for the risk assessment team?
I think first, in a general sense, the first thing that a risk assessment team is supposed to do is find and gather information. They're the ones who get outside support and resources as needed. Once they've gathered that information, they use it to help make better decisions for the company in a general sense.
Chuck, would you add anything to that?
I would. I mean, obviously the topic of our webinar today is workplace violence, but a risk assessment team really can handle a broad range of risk of perils or safety hazards. Some companies have probably started a risk assessment team because of COVID-19, and you could easily transition that into you deal with inclement weather, workplace violence, provided you have the right personnel in place. So we don't want to just push it into the workplace violence. It really has responsibilities far beyond that, because every organization or company faces different types of risk and peril and hazard on a daily basis. And so as the risk assessment team goes about their task and they do discover risk or other hazards that may imperil the safety of their staff, then it becomes incumbent upon them to work with the upper level, the executive team, to interrupt that path towards violence if it involves workplace violence. one thing to keep in mind, COVID-19 is a unique event right now. It's taken a tremendous amount of resources, and we can't let that mask or conceal other things that are going on possibly within in the workplaces. Some folks are excited to get back into the office or back to the work environment, and with that, as we mentioned earlier, comes everything that they're dealing with in their personal lives. So we don't want to become so focused on COVID-19 that we don't deal with all the peripheral things around that.
That's a great point. And I know we often recommend to companies that their risk assessment team get together at least monthly to talk about different issues, because so often we're just doing what we are doing for a living, and we don't even think to, oh, yeah, I saw something going on there too, and we don't think to connect the dots. So the other tool that you both spoke about in the toolbox is the threat assessment. So Tasha, I'd love, well, let me start with Chuck on that one. Chuck, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the threat assessment.
Well, ideally, before we get to the threat assessment, you have a risk assessment team in place who has determined there may be some issues with a particular employee or employees. And because of that concern over what has been discovered, and it's ultra important here, folks, that things be accurate and factual when you decide to take the leap to do a threat assessment, because that's a very comprehensive evaluation of the employer or employees, and it really kind of becomes the driving force for us to help make well thought out recommendations to our clients to help them make informed decisions.
Tasha, could you weigh in on what a threat assessment is?
Sure. So in general, a threat assessment is a way to get a feel for that subject, get a feel for that individual, what's going on in their life right now. What sort of issues do they have? Why are we concerned? Why is this individual, made it on somebody's radar? What have they done before? Have there been previous incidents to this? Let's gather as much information as we can about this individual to see what's going on with them.
So when you're conducting a threat assessment, what are you looking for? Chuck, you want to start that one?
Well, as Tasha mentioned, you really you want to key in on what's taking place in that person's life at that particular time. I know I refer to as an EKG because an EKG captures things at that particular moment in time within your heart. And however, the events that led to that are also important, the prior events. So what's happened currently in their life and what happened to get them to that point in their life are things you should look at. As far as what are we looking for, I mean, there's a whole host of things. It could be criminal, it can be civil, it can be social media. We're looking for staff, co-workers who may have alerted supervisors or management about some concerns they have observed with an employee, things of that nature.
Tasha, would you add to that?
Yeah, I'd say when we're doing a threat assessment, of the places that we look, we're going to look for criminal records to see if there's any criminal trouble. We're going to look at civil records to see if there's divorce or domestic violence or child custody issues. Civil records will also tell us if there's foreclosure or eviction. Sometimes they'll show us cases that are related to collections, which would indicate some financial difficulties. We're going to look at federal records. Federal records, in addition to providing criminal and civil information, can also provide information about bankruptcy. We look at all of that. We're also going to look at the individual's social media and their internet presence. Now, just to be clear, we're not necessarily looking at someone's social media because we expect them to say, hey, I'm really mad at my work and I'm about to go to the office and shoot the place up, and we're not expecting to see that on social media. What we're looking for is like Chuck said, an EKG, a snapshot of that individual at that time. We're also really looking for a support structure, if there is one. Sometimes we see good evidence of that on social media.
You make a great point, because we know that the support structure that somebody has in their lives, whether it be faith-based or it's family or it's coworkers or hobbies that they have, makes such a difference in, when somebody's going through a hard time. And all of us are going to go through difficult situations. Nobody is immune to it. And so what I hear you talking about are patterns or trends or things like that that connect the dots and say, all right, there is something going on, and that this employee may need a little bit of support within the organization, whether that is a referral to EAP or even a reminder. I know I've heard that only 2% of people ever use their EAP services, and is that because people don't know how to, or don't know about them, or don't realize that they're available? So I think you bring up a number of really important things. Now, Chuck, when we're talking about this, Tasha mentioned a number of databases and social media and places like that to look. Where's the most beneficial information usually discovered?
Before I get to that answer, Chris, can I interject something about the previous question that we covered? Yeah, and I think everyone will kind of see the connection here. We're going back to the see something, say something, and the importance of the two-way flow of communication. Tasha mentioned social media, and she's a bona fide expert at uncovering information on social media, but sometimes those accounts are private and we cannot access it. We can't view it. We can't see it. We don't know what's going on, what's being said, who's commenting. And so maybe a coworker is friends with a person on Facebook. Maybe they have seen something that troubles them, and maybe they've screenshotted it and shown it to a manager or supervisor. That type of thing is invaluable to us because we can't see it if we're locked out from it and it's private. So again, it goes back to the see something, say something. But to your question, the most valuable source of information is actually going to be the employer. And if the employer is diligent, conscientious, and managing properly in the right way, then that employer should have the most information about the employee. Whether it's performance related from personnel files or performance evaluation, whether it's coworkers who have brought forward information or concerns, whether it's maybe even a family member who has talked to a supervisor or manager about his or her spouse or loved one, and that information is crucial to us because we don't know the employee, and although we are objective and detached from it, it does help us to make more accurate decisions as we move forward, engaging and assessing the potential threat level of an employee, and certainly in the end will help the employer make more informed decisions about how they want to go forward.
Excellent. So one of the things that we haven't touched on yet is experience as former law enforcement or experience as former military. Weapons, that's something that clients get very concerned about. And I know we've all fielded calls where an employer contacts us and says, that they're concerned that somebody is got a weapon on their workforce or in their workplace and things like that. How does past experience in the military or in law enforcement factor in when you're doing an assessment, when you're doing a threat assessment? Chuck, you want to take that one?
Sure. Anyone who has been in the military or served in law enforcement, I think you can conclude that they at least have had some exposure and some training to firearms. Now, it doesn't mean they're all expert marksmen, okay? Everybody has wide-ranging skills, but it does present a picture of someone who at least knows the basic fundamentals of firearms, handguns and long guns, and had some level of training in the use of that weapon, and also how to handle it, how to clear malfunctions, things like that. Now, I'm going to back up here just a little bit. That goes back to who has the most information, the most valuable information to us, and it's going to be the employer, because, you know, if you have an employee who is talking about they're going to go to the range and get some target time in, or they're going to go to the shooting club and do this, or they're going to go hunting, that's the snippets of information that are very important to us, because then we know that there's no doubt they have access to firearms and know how to use them. They've openly talked about it. And that doesn't necessarily mean anybody's doing anything wrong. I mean, hey, outdoor enthusiasts, hunting, people with firearms, target practicing, that's all well and good. But if the situation starts to deteriorate or escalate, that type of specific information regarding to weapons, particularly firearms, becomes critical in the decision-making process.
Tasha, would you add anything to that?
I'd say Chuck pretty much hit the nail on the head. Again, our best source of information for that is the employer.
All right, so to sum up, because we want to get to questions, and I see there's a number of things that have come through in our chat box. How can a threat assessment support best outcomes? Tasha, you want to start that?
Sure. To put it quite simply, a threat assessment and does what a risk assessment team does. It gives you more information to make better informed and hopefully better decisions. More information is always a good thing.
Chuck, would you add to that?
Well, I think a risk assessment team used in conjunction with a threat assessment can be a pretty formidable duo in helping us to give accurate and credible recommendations to our clients. What we're trying to accomplish in terms of workplace violence, of course, is to interrupt that pathway to violence, to prevent it, to avert it, and to hopefully get the employee some assistance. Now, Chris, you mentioned earlier employee assistance program. I came from law enforcement. We are brutally tough and rough on each other in that profession. There was all kinds of talk about the rubber gun squad. You know, we had an employee assistance program within the city that I work for. And while the conversation was good natured, there were plenty of people within that organization, or that police agency, who did seek employee assistance, and by no means were they members of a rubber gun squad. You know, you don't want to put that stigma on somebody. I believe you quoted a percentage of 2% of people only avail themselves of that opportunity, and that's very disappointing, because there is a lot of help available through employee assistance, and I really hate to see stigmas put on people, particularly with mental health issues, because oftentimes they're crying out for help, and we don't recognize that, or they are kind of discouraged or inhibited from trying to seek that help because they're worried about who's going to say what, or the reputation, or being tough and all that. So there's some things about employee assistance that I believe most organizations can do a better job of promoting it, and I think getting their employees to willingly move towards that level of assistance.
I think you make some really great points. I mean, we talk about culture and how important that is to an organization. We talk about some of the changes that COVID-19 is driving, you know, in businesses. One of them is in communication and collaboration. and the other one would be in mental health areas. I mean, I can't quote the statistics, but it's hard for me to imagine that there's anybody who can go through life without some sort of a mental health crisis, short or long, that needs support from their support group, whatever that is, including their employer. And so, hopefully people on our call can share that information and help create the kind of program within their organization that supports people doing things that they need to do, or supports people supporting other people within their group that they realize are really struggling. And this COVID-19, I mean, everything that we thought we could count on, like children going to school or going to daycare or going to summer camp, or people going to work, and the patterns that are so important to our well-being have been disturbed, and it takes time. And I know with our company, we all came back to the office several weeks ago, and none of us are immune to the challenges and the stresses of everything that's going on around us. So thank you both for this. I would love to turn things over to Amanda. And Amanda, first of all, on the risk assessment team, did we have any findings there?
We did not have any responses, but we did have quite a few questions.
All right, wonderful. Let's go ahead and move forward with those.
Okay. So our first question is, as employees are returning to work, what are some of the flags we should look for that may help identify an employee at risk of not being able to handle the stress of returning to their work environment?
Well, one thing I would say that's coming to my mind right off is again, creating that culture as people that come back. I know that the HR representatives that I've spoken to are really about this, where you acknowledge right up front, from the top of the organization down, that this is really hard. This is extremely hard. This is unprecedented. None of us have experienced anything that compares. We can't, our brains want to draw from something in our past to make us feel better, and there really isn't that to draw from. But that concept of, and we use that here at Produce 3 all the time, a better together, that this is hard, and maybe offering a little bit of flexibility in scheduling, offering an open door policy where people can come in and voice their concerns, and thinking a little bit outside of the box. And that's where that risk assessment team can be so vitally important, because if those are leaders within different departments of your organization, you can get different perspectives on some accommodations that may be possible.
I'd say one of the flags would be obviously escalating behavior. The other sort of key flag it gets a little there's also employees get quiet, you need to check on them. When you're very quiet, employees get loud, you need to check on them. Those would be sort of two indicators. But I do think it comes back to communication, and it's as simple as saying something like, hey, we're all under stress right now. Everybody's really stressed out right now. How you doing? Is everything okay? But just noticing any sort of odd behavior.
I think that's perfect, Tasha. And I would we recommend flexibility and accommodation. Zero tolerance for workplace violence has to remain consistent. I mean, but zero tolerance is terminated. Right. It means that if somebody acts out, that it's addressed up to and including termination. And I think that that's an important distinction.
That employee had a work ethic. They had a demeanor, a personality, a mannerism or mannerisms before they left, before they were furloughed, laid off, before the company shut down because of the pandemic, and now your brass. It's different about them. Have they gained weight? Have they lost her? Or they now argumentative with their Tasha alluded to. But you're looking for changes in their makeup and their personality, and those all could be indicators. And as Chris mentioned, just because somebody has an issue or issues doesn't mean they're going to be fired. I mean, most people are worth salvage and trying to save. I mean, it's much more cost effective to try to salvage someone and save them than it is to fire them and start all over again. And plus, you should care about your workforce. You know, you want them to be successful and succeed, because their success ultimately is your success and the success of the company.
Excellent. Amanda, do we have other questions?
We do. So I think we've touched on this a little bit already, but this question is, does a person with military or law enforcement background pose a different type of workplace violence threat compared to a worker who does not have that sort of background?
Familiarity, what the weapons, if there would be any other difference per se.
Yeah, anybody's ever been in the military, while they may have had some exposure to weapons and firearms, they may not be, serve in the infantry or unit that routinely goes into combat areas and is armed. You know, they could be in a support role. And
I'd have to agree. I think it's just one piece of the puzzle that we're trying to put together. What else do you have, Amanda?
Are there ways that we can help reduce the risk of what we see happening on the streets from coming into our workplaces? Are there red flags we can look for?
I'm not sure. I mean, I guess what we're talking about is the social unrest right now. To me, the most important piece there is access control. I mean, workplace violence and your workplace violence response is very important, and oftentimes that's when we find out that a company hasn't really given enough thought to how people get into their business and how they get out and how you know who belongs. Access control is so very important in a business. I mean, if somebody's going to come in and throw a chair through the window, it's kind of hard to control that access, and we hope you have an alarm. But most of the time, that access control is just being able to, again, control who gets in and how they get in, and do you know they're there? Would you add to that?
I sort of took the question a slightly different way, in that what's happening in the street, and I would assume that refers to social unrest, civil unrest in the workplace. It's like any other. It's like any other stressor. It's just that this happens to be a stressor that's going to affect huge chunks of your population instead of just one individual or a few individuals. People have to understand that there's behaviors that are acceptable at work and there's behaviors that are not acceptable at work. The other half of that equation is that the people in charge, whether that's management, HR, supervisors, have to understand that people are under stress, and so it's having that appropriate first reaction, which is, it's again zero tolerance, but hey man, what's up? That sort of things.
Depending on your business, to have conversations, as long as you set up front. You have a kind of a contract up front with the group that you're speaking to, that everybody's view is important and everybody's perspective is important. But these are hard conversations, and when we're talking about some form of discrimination or bias, these are oftentimes very important conversations to have within an organization, and creates, again, that culture of inclusivity. And so you can use it as a pretty powerful tool.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I certainly think it's reasonable and prudent to conclude that some of the folks, your various companies, business organizations are involved in the protests coming into your doors. Maybe some element of the workforce that disagrees with that. But when you say come in off the street, many of these protesters are gainfully employed, highly educated, and they could be working for your company or your business. And the right to peacefully assemble and demonstrate is there, and they may talk about it openly within the workplace. So I don't want to get off topic, but that's an element that we need to consider as we move forward.
Are there tools that we can use to help reduce or calm down an employee who becomes agitated by his or her manager and expectations put on them during their first few days back at work?
Well, one of the tools is sometimes, when things get very, they escalate. Some of the tools that we recommend people do is, be very engaged, make sure that you're not trapping them, first of all, physically. Make sure that they're in an environment, an escape route, so to speak, where they feel that they have a calm manner, as much as to adult. Get pulled into the conversation, and we keep pulling it to adult. Solutions can be developed, and talking to the employee that we want to help figure out the best solution for you and for the company. Sometimes it's a matter of saying, okay, give me some time. Let me check with some other people. Let me involve and see what kind of resources we have. Let's regroup and meet again tomorrow. And sometimes all you have to do, coming from a place of fear, and fear's not rational. Anger is not rational. None of our emotions are rational. And so it really takes some effort on the listener's part, on the manager's part, to just keep the situation calm, respectful, quiet. Lower the tone if you can, and really listen to what is it that is concerning the employee, and are there solutions to the dilemma? Would you, either of you, add to that?
Well, I agree 100%, Chris. De-escalation is real important. And I think the setting for where you engage that employee and try to resolve or allay their concerns, ideally it wouldn't be in the midst of a wide open workplace floor or warehouse floor where everybody's gathered around and is kind of feeding and fueling off of it. Maybe it would be better if it was more contained and more private, both for the employee and for the organization. Now, at the same time, you don't want to force someone into a corner. So each situation would be uniquely different, and I think you'll have to evaluate it and assess it as such.
Well, I think we have our next program. It's going to be on computer forensic as a tool in investigations. It will be on, and we will be sending out some information.
Thank you very much for coming to our webinar. And again, if you have any questions, that's how to reach us.